You think you're thinking. That's the trap. The most dangerous illusion in the modern world isn't ignorance. It's the confidence that you're already awake. Right now, while you're listening to this, someone you've never met is quietly shaping the next 5 years of your life. Not with force, not with commands, but with incentives, narratives, and invisible lines you walk without ever seeing the fence. You call your movements choices. You call your opinions yours. But most of what you do is reaction, not intention. Reflex, not will. You're playing a game whose rules were written long before you arrived, and the reason it works is simple. No one ever told you the game existed. You were trained to confuse obedience with intelligence. Tests rewarded memorization. Systems rewarded compliance. Praise followed those who followed instructions cleanly and quickly. And somewhere along the way, you accepted the lie that passing checkpoints meant you understood the terrain. But real intelligence has nothing to do with reciting information. It's the ability to see what's actually happening while everyone else is hypnotized by what they're told is happening. It's knowing when to move and when to remain still, when to step forward and when to let someone else take the impact. Machiavelli saw this centuries ago. He watched men praised as virtuous collapse overnight, and men labeled immoral quietly consolidate power. What he understood, and what still terrifies people today, is that morality doesn't determine outcomes. Understanding does. The world doesn't reward goodness. It rewards effectiveness. And there is a hierarchy to this understanding. 10 levels. Most people never make it past the third. Not because they can't, but because each step upward requires killing a comforting illusion. The first level is the sleeper. The sleeper isn't stupid. That's the most important thing to understand. They're functional, productive, socially acceptable. They work, eat, argue, vote, buy, and complain. But none of it is conscious. It's all stimulus and response. Advertising tells them what to want. Media tells them what to fear. Authority tells them what's acceptable to think. And they never stop to ask who's doing the telling. The sleeper only moves when acted upon. Push them, they push back. Praise them, they comply. Threaten them, they freeze. Their opinions aren't formed, they're absorbed. Borrowed from whoever spoke last or loudest. Their beliefs are inherited, not examined. Their direction in life was set by whoever happened to be pointing when they were desperate for guidance. Ask them what they think, and they'll repeat headlines, slogans, or group consensus. Not because they're lying, but because they genuinely can't tell the difference between thinking and repeating. The sleeper craves 3 things: authority, routine, and consensus. Authority, so they don't have to decide. Routine, so they don't have to adapt. Consensus, so they don't have to stand alone. Because independent thought is heavy. It carries responsibility. It risks isolation. And the sleeper would rather be comfortable than accountable. The system loves sleepers. Because sleepers are fuel. They keep structures running without resistance. They work jobs they don't question, buy things they don't need, defend causes they don't understand, and call it life. They're not evil. They're asleep. And asleep people can't be reasoned with. You don't argue someone awake. They have to choose it. Waking up from this level is brutal. It means admitting that most of your life wasn't really yours, that the thoughts you defended weren't your own, that you were a passenger pretending to drive. Most people refuse this realization and sink deeper into the dream. Born, trained, used, and buried without a single moment of real consciousness. The second level is the believer. The believer wakes up just enough to feel the sting. They realize something is wrong. They sense manipulation, control, lies. But instead of standing in uncertainty, they rush to replace one master with another. They adopt an ideology, a movement, a rigid framework that promises answers. And once again, thinking stops. Belief takes over. It doesn't matter which belief, political, religious, moral, countercultural. What matters is that the ideology now does the thinking for them. It tells them who's good, who's evil, what's acceptable to question, and what's forbidden. The believer feels awake because they rejected the mainstream. But all they did was change channels. Where the sleeper obeys authority, the believer obeys doctrine. Different master, same leash. The believer confuses moral certainty with intelligence. They think being on the right side makes them powerful. But you can be morally correct and strategically useless. You can be righteous and completely ineffective. The believer never sees this because their identity is welded to their beliefs. Question the belief, and you threaten their sense of self. So they react instantly, predictably, loudly. Conviction without consideration. Belief feels good. It provides community, purpose, identity. But it's still sleep, just with better branding. Real intelligence keeps questioning, especially the things it holds most dearly. The believer can't do that because doubt feels like betrayal, and betrayal feels like death. If any of this is uncomfortable, that's the point. Discomfort is the signal you're close to a nerve, and nerves are where awakening begins. The third level is where intelligence becomes a performance. This is the mimic. The mimic notices something subtle and dangerous. People don't reward real understanding nearly as much as they reward the appearance of it. Sound smart and doors open. Use the right words, quote the right sources, adopt the right tone, and suddenly, people listen. Respect follows. Opportunities appear. So the mimic doesn't chase depth, they chase optics. They collect language the way an actor collects costumes. Phrases, concepts, references, just enough to sound informed, just enough to impress, just enough to pass as someone who gets it. And in most environments, that's enough. Because most environments don't test thinking. They test presentation. The mimic thrives where surface-level intelligence is rewarded. Social media, corporate culture, academic spaces where jargon matters more than outcomes. They can debate endlessly, but rarely build. They can argue positions they've memorized, but collapse when faced with a new problem that requires original thought. Ask them to simplify an idea, and you'll watch them struggle, because clarity exposes the absence of understanding. They are mirrors, not minds. Their opinions shift with the room, not always consciously, not always manipulatively, often instinctively. They adapt to whoever holds the social power in the moment. There is no center, no internal framework, just reflection. And that's what makes them dangerous, not because they're strong, but because they're convincing. At lower levels, mimics are indistinguishable from real thinkers. Vocabulary masks emptiness. Confidence disguises fragility, but pressure exposes them. When real decisions need to be made, when consequences are real, when performance is no longer enough, the mimic collapses. Because memorized answers don't solve real problems. This level is crowded with people who read summaries and claim mastery, who quote ideas they've never lived, who use complexity as camouflage for shallow thinking. They look intelligent, they sound intelligent, but they are brittle. And eventually, the world stops asking how smart you sound and starts asking what you can actually do. Moving past this level requires a painful trade. You must give up the addiction to being seen as intelligent and replace it with the discipline of being effective. You must trade applause for results, validation for leverage. And most people refuse, because applause feels like progress, even when it isn't. Noise feels like movement, and silence feels like death. The fourth level is where everything shifts. This is the calculator. The calculator stops performing and starts operating. They don't care how they're perceived. They care about outcomes. They look at situations and don't ask what should happen. They ask what will happen. They don't ask what's right. They ask what works. They see incentives instead of intentions, structures instead of stories. Rules, to them, are not moral boundaries. They're environmental conditions. Like weather, you don't argue with the rain. You prepare for it. You use it. You exploit it. The calculator understands that every moral framework serves someone's interest, and if you don't know whose interest it serves, it's probably not yours. Emotion no longer drives action. Strategy does. When insulted, they don't react. They assess. Is this person useful, dangerous, irrelevant? And then they respond accordingly. Not to express themselves, but to position themselves. They are always thinking 3 moves ahead. While others are still processing what just happened, the calculator is already planning what happens next. This is the fox. Clever, adaptive, hard to trap. They see manipulation before it lands, spot traps before stepping into them, recognize the game before agreeing to play. But this clarity comes at a cost. Once you see how systems work, once you realize how easily people are guided and used, trust erodes. Every offer has a hook. Every kindness has an angle. Every smile hides a calculation. The calculator survives, often thrives. They avoid disasters others walk straight into. They land on their feet. But there's a ceiling here, because no matter how clever you are, you're still playing someone else's game. You didn't design the rules. You just learned how to exploit them. To move beyond this level requires courage, not intelligence. Courage, because seeing clearly is safe. Acting on what you see is dangerous. That's where the 5th level begins. The operator. The operator doesn't just understand what needs to be done. They do it. They make the call others delay. Take the risk others avoid. Move when everyone else is frozen. Chaos sharpens them. Pressure clarifies them. While others panic, the operator executes. They lead visibly, decisively. Everyone knows who they are. Everyone knows where they stand. They are the lion. Powerful, direct, impossible to ignore. And this is what most people imagine when they think of power. But visible power has a flaw. It paints a target. The operator is always under fire, every move scrutinized, every mistake amplified. There's no hiding, no deflection, no rest. No, every problem becomes theirs. Every failure lands on their name. They burn bright. They change things through force of will. But intensity is expensive, and history is filled with operators who rose fast and fell hard. The operator understands fear, chooses effectiveness over approval, results over popularity. But fear is fragile. Someone is always becoming more feared, more ruthless, more strategic, and eventually the lion is challenged. This is where the operator realizes a final, brutal truth. The most effective control doesn't announce itself. It doesn't command. It influences. And that realization opens the door to the next level. The 6th level is where power stops being loud. This is the puppeteer. The puppeteer understood something the operator learned too late. Visibility attracts resistance. Force creates enemies. Authority invites challenge. So they disappear from the front and move behind the curtain. They stop commanding and start shaping. Stop ordering and start suggesting. The puppeteer doesn't tell people what to do. They make people want to do it. They don't threaten. They arrange incentives. They don't argue. They alter context. Outcomes bend in their favor, and no one can quite explain why. There are no fingerprints, no obvious moves, just results that consistently land where they intended. This is psychological power. The puppeteer studies desire and fear the way an engineer studies physics. They know what people crave, what they avoid, what stories they tell themselves to justify their behavior. And they use that knowledge not with cruelty, but with precision. Every relationship becomes leverage. Every interaction becomes a thread. Not because they hate people, but because they see people as systems. They read you quickly. They know which buttons matter and which don't. When to apply pressure, when to pull away, when to plant an idea and wait. You think you're choosing, you think you're acting freely, but the environment was arranged long before you arrived, and you're moving exactly where the currents were designed to take you. This level is terrifying because it's invisible. You can't fight what you can't see. You can't resist what you don't know is influencing you. That's why the puppeteer doesn't want credit. Credit exposes. They let others take the spotlight. Let others wear the crown. Control doesn't need applause. It needs outcomes. But there is a cost here, and it's heavier than most expect. When you're always calculating perception, always adjusting masks, always playing roles, something erodes. The line between strategy and identity blurs. The performance becomes permanent. The mask fuses to the face. And one day, the puppeteer looks around and realizes no one knows them. Not even themselves. They're surrounded by people, but deeply alone. Trusted, but not known. Influential, but hollow. Power without intimacy. Control without connection. And eventually, that emptiness becomes unbearable. Because what's the point of winning if there's no one left who sees you without the mask? That crisis is what pushes a few beyond manipulation altogether. Into the seventh level, the architect. The architect doesn't play the game. They design it. This is a fundamental shift. The architect realizes that fighting within systems is temporary. Manipulating people is fragile. True power doesn't come from controlling moves. It comes from defining what moves are possible. So they stop focusing on individuals and start building structures. They design frameworks, institutions, rules, incentives. Once those are in place, everyone else fights, competes, and struggles inside a space the architect already owns. While others argue over outcomes, the architect controls the boundaries of reality itself. They think in decades, not weeks, generations, not cycles. They plant seeds that won't sprout for years, build foundations that remain invisible until they're unavoidable. While others chase wins, the architect owns the terrain. They appear detached, passive, even irrelevant. Because their work isn't visible in moments, it's visible in patterns. By the time people realize they're operating inside someone else's design, it's too late to escape it. The rules feel natural, inevitable, just the way things are. This is the level of founders, institution builders, those whose influence outlives their presence. Their power isn't in action, it's in design. And that requires a sacrifice most people can't make. Immediate recognition. The architect trades applause today for control tomorrow, silence now for permanence later. But even this level has a ceiling, because designing systems still ties you to outcomes, to legacy, to influence over others. The eighth level breaks that attachment. This is the sovereign. The sovereign achieves something most people think is impossible: complete internal control. This level isn't about dominating others at all. It's about mastering yourself so thoroughly that the external world loses its grip. Emotions still arise, anger, fear, desire, but they no longer rule. The sovereign observes them the way one observes weather, without resistance, without identification, then chooses their response deliberately. No reflex, no compulsion, no reaction. They don't need titles, don't need permission, don't need validation. Their power is internal, untouchable. It can't be given or taken because it doesn't depend on circumstances. They move when movement serves them, remain still when stillness serves them. And the choice is always free. This is the level of true self-mastery, not the one who controls the room, but the one who can sit in any room and remain unchanged. They don't need to prove anything, don't need to win, don't need to manipulate. They see the board clearly, but aren't attached to the game. Most people never reach this level because it requires giving up what they think power is. Visibility, recognition, control. The sovereign needs none of it. They're free in a way lower levels can't comprehend. Because freedom isn't doing whatever you want. It's wanting nothing that can be taken from you. But even sovereignty isn't the end. Because there is a level beyond identity itself. The 9th level is where identity dissolves. This is the void. The void is not emptiness in the way people fear. It is emptiness in the way fire clears a forest so something stronger can grow. At this level, attachment is gone. Ego is gone. Fear of loss is gone. Even the instinct to preserve an image, a role, a self, released. The void cannot be manipulated because there is nothing to grab. You can't threaten someone who has nothing they're afraid of losing. You can't bribe someone who wants nothing. You can't shame someone who no longer needs to be seen a certain way. The entire machinery that controls human behavior simply fails. The void sees the game completely, not just their position in it, but every level below, every pattern, every strategy, every illusion. They see it the way you see a map from above. Clear, obvious, almost boring. And because they see it so clearly, they act very little. This is the part that confuses people. They think power is constant motion, constant action, constant dominance. But most movement is noise. Most action is distraction. Most effort is compensation for blindness. The void moves only when movement is necessary, not out of restraint, out of precision. This is why the void terrifies people at lower levels. You can't predict them, can't read them, can't frame them. They don't react the way they're supposed to. They don't chase what others chase. They don't fear what others fear. Their presence feels unsettling because it exposes how much of everyone else's behavior is automatic. Historically, this is the monk who walked away from everything and somehow became more powerful by doing so. Not hiding, not retreating. Simply done. Finished with the illusion that the game was mandatory. They didn't lose. They stopped agreeing. Someone with nothing to gain and nothing to lose is unpredictable. And unpredictability is the most dangerous position there is if they choose to move. Most of the time they don't, because they've already seen that the game itself is an agreement, a collective fiction, and they withdrew consent. They are present, but not attached. Here, but not here. Watching everything while belonging to nothing. You can't fight them, can't compete with them, can't even engage them. There's nothing to push against, no leverage, no hooks. And then, beyond even this, there is the final level. Not a state you aim for, not a strategy you execute, something that happens only as a consequence of time, depth, and irreversible impact. The 10th level is the myth. The myth no longer exists as a person. They've become an idea, a force, a gravity well. Their influence continues long after their presence is gone. People invoke their name without ever meeting them, follow principles they articulated without knowing the source, live inside structures they built without realizing who designed them. This is influence without identity, power without position, presence without presence. You can't point to the myth in real time. You only see the effects afterward. Civilization shaped, behavior altered, thinking reoriented. The myth bends reality indirectly, not through action, but through the actions they inspired in others. This is the level of the thinker whose ideas outlive their body, the founder whose name became the system, the invisible hand that moved history without being part of it. You can't become the myth intentionally. The moment you try, you disqualify yourself. It's not ambition, it's inevitability. Machiavelli reached this level. Dead for centuries, still shaping how power is understood, still influencing decisions, still dangerous. That's the myth. And myths don't need to announce themselves. So now the question lands where it belongs. Not where you wish you were, not where you pretend to be, but where you actually operate when no one is watching. Under pressure, in silence, when comfort and truth collide. Most people never move past level 3. They spend their lives copying, believing, performing, thinking they're thinking while repeating patterns written by someone else. And that isn't an accident. Systems are built to reward obedience and call it intelligence. Performance and call it merit. Real intelligence is disruptive. It threatens order. It destabilizes comfortable lies. You don't move up by learning more. Information doesn't do it. Knowledge doesn't do it. You move up by removing illusions, by letting parts of yourself die. Each level demands a sacrifice. Comfort, righteousness, validation, connection, peace, identity, attachment, everything. Most people won't pay that price. They'll feel something listening to this, then return to what's familiar, because familiarity feels safer than freedom. But the moment you stop reacting and start choosing, something changes. The moment you see the game, you stop being played. The moment you control your response instead of following your programming, you become dangerous. And dangerous people don't just survive the world, they reshape it. Your next move starts now. If you've made it this far, you already feel it. The quiet pressure behind your eyes. The subtle discomfort that doesn't come from confusion, but from recognition. This is not inspiration. Inspiration fades. This is confrontation. And confrontation changes people, whether they admit it or not. Most viewers never reach this point because the mind defends itself the moment truth threatens identity. They scroll away. They rationalize. They say, "Interesting," and return to their habits unchanged. But if you're still listening, it's because something inside you understands a dangerous fact. Once you see clearly, pretending becomes impossible. Awakening is not a breakthrough, it's a breakdown. The first thing that collapses is the story you've been living inside. The story where your struggles were purely external, where your limitations were imposed, where your reactions were justified. You begin to see how much of your life was spent responding instead of deciding, how often you mistook familiarity for truth, how many of your choices were simply the most socially acceptable reactions available. This is the moment people misunderstand. They think awakening makes you feel powerful. It doesn't at first. It makes you feel exposed, because the illusion of innocence disappears. You can no longer say, "I didn't know." You can no longer hide behind confusion. Awareness removes excuses before it grants freedom, and that's why most people stop here. They become aware enough to feel frustrated, but not disciplined enough to change. They see manipulation everywhere, but still fall for it. They recognize patterns, but continue repeating them. Awareness without transformation becomes a curse. It turns into cynicism, arrogance, a quiet resentment toward a world they now see but haven't yet mastered. This is where ego tries to survive by rebranding itself. It says, "At least I understand." But understanding alone is not intelligence. Intelligence is embodied, operational, behavioral. Real intelligence begins when your nervous system changes, when the same triggers no longer produce the same reactions, when praise doesn't inflate you, when criticism doesn't derail you, when urgency stops dictating your decisions, when silence no longer feels like weakness. This is the internal shift that no book can give you, and no video can finish for you. At this stage, life doesn't get louder. It gets quieter. The noise that once filled your mind, constant evaluation, explanation, emotional rehearsal, starts to fade. And in that quiet, many panic. Without the old identity to cling to, there's a sense of emptiness, a personal void. Not the void of detachment, but the void left behind when the old self dissolves. Most people rush to fill it. They rebuild the same identity with better language, same fears, same needs, just sharper vocabulary. But if you stay in that emptiness without rushing to define yourself, something else begins to form. Alignment. You stop asking what you should think and start noticing what is. You stop narrating your life internally and start acting without commentary. Decisions feel cleaner, faster, not because you're impulsive, but because there's less internal resistance. Your behavior changes before your beliefs do, and that's the key. Identity no longer leads action. Action reshapes identity. You speak less, not because you're withdrawn, but because you no longer need to process aloud. You observe more, not out of suspicion, but clarity. You begin to recognize that most conversations are emotional negotiations, not exchanges of truth. And you stop participating automatically. People feel this shift even if they can't name it. Some drift away without conflict. They were attached to the old version of you, the predictable one. Others become cautious. Your reactions no longer follow the script. A few become curious. They sense stability, grounding, something rare in a reactive world. This is not dominance. It's coherence. Coherent people are difficult to manipulate, not because they're aggressive, but because they're not hungry, not for approval, not for validation, not for constant engagement. Hunger is leverage, and you've started removing it. Here, morality changes form. It stops being a performance and becomes a choice. Kindness becomes intentional instead of compulsive. Empathy becomes selective instead of automatic. Boundaries stop feeling defensive and start feeling natural. This is what people mislabel as coldness. It isn't. It's compression. Less emotional leakage. Less waste. Less noise. And now comes the most uncomfortable realization of all. You are responsible, not in a motivational sense, in a literal one. Once you see clearly, every reaction you still choose is yours. Every pattern you repeat is no longer accidental. Every compromise is conscious. This is why awakening feels heavy. Freedom is not light, it is weight. There is no authority left to blame. No ideology to hide behind. No system to point at and say, "That made me this way." There is only cause and effect. At this point, you stop trying to change people directly. You understand that confrontation rarely transforms. environment does. You adjust access. You change standards. You withdraw energy from what depletes you and reinforce what aligns. And the world recalibrates around you without a speech, without an argument. You also understand something sobering. Most people are not meant to fully wake up. Not now. Not ever. Systems require predictability. They require function. Sleepers, believers, mimics, they're not failures. They're structural. Your task is not to save them. Your task is to stop being usable. Usable by narratives you didn't choose. Usable by systems that feed on reactivity. Usable by people who benefit from your predictability. From here on, growth becomes subtle, quiet, almost invisible, but it compounds. Your time feels heavier, your attention sharper, your presence more deliberate. You don't feel like a hero. You feel clear. And clarity in a world addicted to stimulation is power. So don't rush to become anything. That urgency itself is leftover conditioning. Instead, watch where you still react automatically, where approval still pulls you, where fear still accelerates you, where identity still hijacks perception. Those are the remaining chains. Remove them patiently, without drama, without announcements, because the people who truly reshape reality are rarely the loudest, the most visible, or the most celebrated. They're the ones who stopped being predictable. And once you stop being predictable, the game doesn't end. It simply stops owning you.